Brian Humphries. Welcome to the CU CateCast, and this week we're doing the Book of Ecclesiastes. Now, hand to my heart, before I did prep work for this talk that I am giving right now, the one and the only thing that I could tell you about the Book of Ecclesiastes is the word vanity. I know that some cat named Koheleth said that everything was vanity, and he used that word a lot. And that was 100% of my knowledge of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I knew it was a wisdom book, because you do some overviews in seminary, but I mean, it just sounds hard, Ecclesiastes. It just sounds difficult. I now know that the book of Ecclesiastes was written somewhere around 300 BC or so, maybe 250, 240, depending if you talk to some people, maybe slightly earlier than that. But verse 1 is important for us to take special note of because, quote, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So the author, ostensibly, is Solomon, although the book was written a long time later based upon vocabulary usage, based upon words that really didn't exist in ancient Hebrew. And so we're pretty sure this is one of these things where the author is trying to say, look, I am taking the wisdom of Solomon and I am applying it to our situation here and now. So the author is claiming that the book is a book of Solomon's wisdom, but it does not seem that anybody believes Solomon sat down and wrote this. Now, for those keeping track, this is the second wisdom book in a row that claims to be written by Solomon and that claims to be bringing up Solomon's wisdom for these days, which is not unusual if you think about it, where people are saying, look, the great wise man of our culture is such, and therefore I'm going to bring forward his wisdom. There are plenty of books right now of the founding fathers' wisdom applied to today, or the wisdom of Fulton Sheen for today, or, for other people, the wisdom of the Buddha for today, or how Elon Musk would deal with a conversation with Thomas Jefferson. Those kinds of books exist in our own culture. And so it's not necessarily an oddity if for the Hebrew people, the great wise man of their entire culture is Solomon, that any book purporting to deal with what we would call philosophy would want to reference Solomon. And for those interested, the book of Ecclesiastes, the word Ecclesiastes is a Latin word. It just means book of wisdom. That's it. There's no clever naming. There's no secret code there. And that said, the author is not super well known. We don't have any idea who he is, but we have a sense that he is what we would call a philosopher, living about 300 years before Jesus showed up on the scene. And he is going to be doing something remarkable. He is going to be trying to figure out why life is meaningful and valuable without reference to Jesus, which is a relatively complicated thing to do because you have folks who are just sort of kind of believing in the afterlife, but not really super clearly. And nowadays, we'd have someone like Camus, or we would have someone like Jean-Paul Sartre who would sit around a French cafe smoking, drinking espresso and bickering about the world and wondering what's the meaning of the life anyway, that's what's happening. This book is the Jewish way of understanding why life should be considered good, valuable, and worth living, worth investing in if there is no eternal life that we know of. It's basically the modern philosophy of nihilism, but responded to 1,800 years before it existed, or 2,200 years before it existed, by Jewish Hebrew philosophy. It's an incredibly neat thing when you stop and think about what this guy is doing, because we have the idea that these modern philosophers, they're so smart, but they really aren't. They're just, taking the same rehashed questions that previous dealt with, adding caffeine and nicotine and answering them again. And so bless them, I'm not a huge fan of the French, but it is what it is. So the big theme in Ecclesiastes is the purpose of life. Why do we do what we do? Why should we do what we do? And we're going to get into the question of the value of life, which is something that's not we haven't really considered thus far. We've considered the value of some people's lives, right? You got to keep the king alive. And we got to worry about Ruth because Ruth was related to the king. And we got to get ourselves concerned about Moses because he was outstanding. And you got to worry about this one because he is the son of Israel or whatever. But for most people, your ordinary schmo, nobody cared if they lived or died. There was no such thing as the value of life for a peasant. There was no such thing as the value of life for somebody who was not contributing to the society. And there was certainly no such thing as the value of life for people who are not Jewish, who are not part of the chosen people. And so the fact that Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, we'll just call him the preacher who's writing the book, the fact that he's trying to get into this question of why is life in and of itself valuable, and not just specific important individuals, but the poor schmo. I mean, anybody, why do they matter? Even in Job, we don't care about this at all. Job doesn't care one iota about all the people who die and all the people who suffer. He's concerned about his own situation, and God is super good and wonderful. But Job would just let him die. You know, here the preacher is really trying to kind of dig into and figure out what's going on. So he's confronting the mystery of death. He's confronting these questions, and he's saying, look, life is short, so we have to make the best of it that we can, but why? Now, in our individualistic society, Ecclesiastes, or I should say in our individual society, this kind of feels like an odd conclusion, right? Because Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre don't come to the conclusion that life is meaningless and therefore we should do the best we can with it. They come to the conclusion that life is meaningless and therefore everything is meaningless. And then you have some folks on the side of what is now called YOLO, you only live once, and so we should just maximize our personal happiness. This is what's called utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill is the great founder of this school of thinking. But this idea of we should simply do whatever makes us happy. Or we have the idea of what Immanuel Kant would refer to as deontology, the idea of we have duties to others, and if I want to see the best for my people, my family, then I should focus on them. Going all the way back to the Iliad, we have the idea of all that matters is my reputation and the power and success of my family, and so maybe I should simply do what I do in this world in order to see the later generations be assisted. Or you could go to someone like Charles Darwin, who says, I don't believe anything has any meaning because the entire world is mechanistic. We have all these kinds of evolutionary processes, and so it doesn't matter what I do or why I do it. Things are simply going to play out the way they're going to play out due to the natural mechanistic nature of the universe, and so it is what it is. And of course, there's a pile of other philosophers trying to answer this question, but ostensibly from the Jewish point of view, and again, we're late in the Jewish story because Jesus is right around the corner. From the Jewish point of view, the answer to the question of why we should do what we do comes down to life is short, and so we have to make the best that we can of it because it's a gift from God, and because God deserves to be paid attention to, and that's it. And we're there. And so there is some Immanuel Kant in that. There's some of kind of the German notion of duty built into it. But that's the way that the Jewish people, in a very, very, very thin nutshell, believed that the world and life was to be understood without reference to eternity or Jesus. Now, in our individualistic society, that feels somewhat insane. Most of us would line up behind someone like Camus in facing a death without an afterlife, and we would say, doesn't mean anything. If there is no afterlife, it doesn't mean anything. What if I get a red card from Jesus and he says, you're not going to heaven? It's been decided, it's over. As of, May the 1st, 2022, you don't get to go to heaven. Here's your red card, and you're out. Our response would probably be, given the society in which we live, utter nihilism. Nothing matters. Absolutely nothing matters. And so I could either choose to kill myself, or I could choose to hurt other people, or I could choose to do anything I want, or maybe I'll just get as much drugs as I can, or whatever, and just try to drown my pain and sorrow. But there's this kind of individualistic nihilism in the culture in which we live. But in the family-first culture of Israel, we're not living for ourselves. Wisdom is about the survival of my family and about the survival of my tribe, and it's about making sure that God continues to get all of the praise and worship he deserves. Because remember, God is one among many for functionally. While the Hebrews knew that God was the only real God, there are a pile of idols out there. And you got the Babylonians, you got the Assyrians, you got all these other folks who all have their own individual gods. And so, you have this strong sense of, I have a greater duty than myself. Now, as with any good book-length sermon, which is what Ecclesiastes is, there's no clear outline here. This is some Joel Osteen stuff, running this direction and stop and running that direction. Then we got to have a hymn. Then his wife's got to come out and pitch her book. And then we got to get back around it. There's a lot of moving pieces. And it's 12 chapters of meditations and musings and thoughts that are probably all kind of coalescing in one kind of ideal, but it's not something where somebody sat down like I would do and write from point A to point B in an excruciating amount of structure, order, and style. And while that may not sound entertaining to read 12 chapters of somewhat confusing, kind of musings, it really is quite good. It's a good book because every time we come through another verse, we go, well, yeah, but Jesus solves that whole problem. Or gosh, do I think like that? Am I somehow living parts of my life without reference to eternity? And so it's really good. And he digs into a lot of things that we care about from the natural world. Things like the sun and the ocean, but also things like hard work and sex and wealth and suffering. And even these existential questions about what happens if I don't feel fulfilled? What if I find myself as a millennial and feeling like I'm not making a difference in the universe? These are questions that this guy is really trying to answer. By way of an outline, the book is not just complete chaos. There are three or four-ish, there are three-ish 4-chapter parts. So you're talking about part 1, part 2, part 3, but it's ish. There's some back and forth. The first part gives us the preacher's view of the world, roughly the first 4 chapters. Then we have about 4 chapters-ish on the way that we should live our lives. And then we have the remaining 4 chapters on kind of mixed advice about gaining wisdom. Now, we do have to note that all the way through here, Koheleth has some snide remarks about those who do not try to live with wisdom. Those who just kind of let the good times roll, or those just who kind of ride their way through. And he kind of looks at them and goes, these people don't even count because they shouldn't be counted. Their lives have no value. If they actually sought wisdom, then they would be worth saving. But as it is, these are the people in steerage on the Titanic. Let them drown. So there's still not a sense that any and everybody is valuable. There's the sense that those people who make value in their life deserve to be valued. And so you definitely get some pretty rough remarks here for those who are not seeking wisdom. But he does seem to imply that anyone who wants to can seek wisdom. And it's in sort of the same sort of way that we as Christians would say, look, we want everybody to go to heaven. We want everybody to be happy with the Lord. But if you insist on doing it your own way and you don't want to talk about Jesus and you have zero interest in trying to be anything other than whatever you want to be, if you're just going to be a Generation Z, if that's just your story, you go do you. And if you have to burn, you got to burn. That's just the way it is. And that seems insensitive, but at a certain point, there's some people we can't help. And so he seems to have that same mentality of some folks you can't fix. It's like you go to the doctor 6 times and the doctor says, you got to stop smoking 3 packs a day. And you go, no, it's fine. I'm prepared to do whatever you say. Just give me more drugs. And you're like, that's not going to work. You've got to stop smoking 3 packs a day. You can't help people who don't want to be helped. And he definitely kind of imbibes that way of thinking. Koheleth, the preacher, is a genuinely wise man who's struggling to make sense of the world without the gigantic missing piece that is Jesus Christ. And in fact, he functions as a kind of an icon of the way modern people are trying, honestly, to understand the world without Jesus, who said, look, we got to start by saying there is no Jesus, or we got to start by saying there is no God. And I don't want to do with any of those things. Now, how do I understand the world? How do I kind of understand how the world works? And it's kind of like, well, if you start by rejecting certain things, what can we do? How can we help you? And so this book actually gives us some insight into the way a lot of modern people think, because they're trying to say, how can I understand the world by seeking truth, but actively rejecting anything that points me toward religion or anything that points me toward Jesus in particular? How do I live my life without those things? And you kind of find Kohelet's wisdom. You kind of find this is how he's trying to understand the world. And so I think the book is valuable. I think it's worthwhile. It is a difficult read, there's no question. Again, it breaks up into his worldview, the notion of what the story with wisdom is, and then some kind of miscellaneous musings. So it's not unreadable, but we have to keep in the back of our mind, this is a guy who is trying to get his head around the world and the purpose of life without reference to Jesus. And if we keep that in the back of our minds, these things kind of fall into place. It helps if you have a couple degrees in philosophy. It's one of the few times it helps if you have a couple degrees in philosophy, but you don't need it at all. 12 chapters is certainly doable, and the rest of the wisdom literature is going to be challenging, and so it's not that bad. Definitely something we can continue to work on. So that takes us through the book of Ecclesiastes. We have now made it through the wisdom literature of Job, the Psalms, the Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Next, the Song of Songs. It is by far, for me at least, the most confusing book in the entire Bible, without any kind of asterisk or anything like that. And so it will be a relatively short talk where I go, here's the outline, and I have no idea what's going on. It is an erotic love poem about the way in which Israel is meant to be passionately in love with the Lord, and it uses imagery that is very, very marital and makes it somewhat difficult for us to get our head around. A lot of the great spiritual masters reference it constantly, so I'm going to do my best, but it's a tough job. But that will be next week, the Song of Songs. This has been the Book of Ecclesiastes. I'm Father Ryan Humphries. It's been the CU CateCast, and I hope you have an excellent day.